Since its inception in the 1980s, World Youth Day has drawn millions of young Catholics to its events for the purpose of strengthening the faith of the next generation. But do World Youth Days actually accomplish their mission, and should they continue to be held? That's what we're going to talk about today on Crisis Point. Hello, I'm Eric Sammons, your host, editor-in-chief of Crisis Magazine. Before we get started, I just want to encourage people to smash that like button, to subscribe to the channel, let other people know about what we're doing here. Also, you can follow us on social media at Crisis Mag. So our guest today is Matt Gaspers. He is the managing editor of Catholic Family News, a monthly journal and online media apostolate devoted to promoting the traditional Catholic faith and the precious heritage of Christian civilization. He's also been published by the Fatima Crusader, OnePeterFive, and LifeSiteNews. Welcome to the program, Matt.
Thanks, Eric. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm so glad. This was an idea you thought of. World Youth Day is going on right now as you record this. And when this goes public, the World Youth Day will still be going on in Lisbon, the 2023 World Youth Day. And it's a great topic to talk about because, I mean, there's a lot to say about World Youth Days. I think they're a major event in the church, have been now for more than 30 years. And they have a big impact. For good or for ill, mostly that's what I think we're going to talk about.
Yes.
So I think most people know what World Youth Day is, but Pope John Paul II started World Youth Days in the 1980s. And the idea was that every 2 to 3 years, you have this global gathering of youth with the purpose of really encouraging young people in their Catholic faith, letting them see the universality of the church. And that's kind of, and it's modeled.
And to get young people excited about the faith. I think that was part of the goal.
Yeah, exactly. Get young people excited about the faith. I think that's a great point you make, because the way it's designed is to be kind of a festival. It's right. Designed. I mean, people have kind of sometimes call it the Catholic Woodstock. And so the general vibe is more of a festival than anything else. And I think World Youth Day, to me, it was really propelled into kind of its global impact it had in the early 90s with the 1991 one in Poland, which was a big deal because obviously JP2.
Right.
And then the 1993 one in Denver, which I'll talk about here in a minute. So what I want to do is, both of us have been to a World Youth Day. I've been to 1993 in Denver. You've been to 2002 in Toronto. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay, so we're both going to tell our World Youth Day stories to start off. Yours is way better than mine, so I'm going to start with mine.
All right.
I'll let you tell yours. And we'll actually have a link to your World Youth Day experience article as well in the show notes for people. But so I went to the 1993 World Youth Day in Denver. Now,
I just wanted to mention I live in the Archdiocese of Denver, and I think there's still an ongoing impact being felt here from that, just as a side note.
You live there now in the Archdiocese of Denver?
Correct. Not in Denver proper. I live about an hour northeast, but yes, in the Archdiocese.
Yeah, it was, I mean, to say it was a big deal is an understatement, because I remember, so I was received in the church in April of 1993, and World Youth Day was in August of 1993. Yeah. And I remember the lead up to it was everybody predicted in the establishment Catholic media and the establishment mainstream media that would be a big failure. Why would a bunch of young Americans come out to see this old dude from, Europe? And that was how it was presented. It was going to be a colossal failure.
Clearly, they didn't know John Paul II.
Exactly, and that's exactly because remember of course, 90s is when JP2 really came into his own as the rock star pope. For good or bad, that's just what he became. In the 1980s, he was well known, but it was like he still was kind of just a pope. In the 90s is where this, and I think World Youth Day in Denver was one of the things that propelled him to that stature. And so I went, because I was working for a pro-life group, and we wanted to, a college pro-life group, and we wanted to raise money. So we designed these beautiful t-shirts with an icon of Our Lady on the front, and it had like our name on the back, and we sold them on the streets at World Youth Day in order to raise money. And it was kind of funny because we progressed. We didn't have, we were college kids. We didn't have like a permit or anything like that. We started.
Probably didn't need one back then.
Yeah, well, that was the funny thing. We started right in in the major areas, and the officials kept pushing us away, saying, "No, you can't sell here." We kept going further and further out. Eventually, we sold out though in like 2 days anyway, and so the rest of the time was just spent at World Youth Day. And I will say, for me, it was a big deal because, like I said, I've been Catholic for 6 months. And as a Protestant, United Methodist, my whole conception of Christianity was basically my suburban church I grew up in. I mean, I had
Right.
very little global or outside experience of Christianity, and to see so many Catholics. I mean, you'd walk down the street and literally a bishop would walk by you. And I just was like, I mean, I was 23 at the time and 22 at the time. And to me, this was it really was a big deal. I do also remember that this was kind of funny because I didn't really process it till later. When we went to the event where the Pope shows up at Mile High Stadium, the stadium that was in Denver at the time, and he's coming, and like the screaming by the girls when he showed up. I will say, I think this is my personality more than anything. I'm not really a super like emotional type guy, like express like that. I will say I did think like, okay, this might be a little bit much. I mean, even though I was kind of like, this is great that the Pope is the guy we're cheering for.
Right.
The fact he was treated like the Beatles had just come into town was a little bit odd. But anyway, so I will say though that was, I had a positive experience of it. I don't know how to put it. I felt like it did help me in a lot of ways. I knew very little. I mean, I'd just been Catholic for 6 months. I had learned enough to become Catholic, obviously, but you don't know anything 6 months into being Catholic. And the other thing is that I do know a lot of people, a lot of vocations that occurred because of where they credit World Youth Day 1993. A lot of American priests became priests because of, not only because of, but World Youth Day
was a major catalyst. Yeah.
Yes, a major catalyst. So that was kind of my experience, was just that I liked the idea of this support for the Pope. I liked seeing the universal nature. It was very foreign to me, this idea of, the whole world, the whole church is Catholic and universal, and just the enthusiasm I saw of people for the faith. It did rub off on me. I obviously was a new Catholic, so I was already enthusiastic, but it kind of bolstered that as well. So that's my World Youth Day. I haven't been to any since then. That was the only one I've ever been to. I've been to when the popes come to town and stuff like that, but no World Youth Day. So now tell your story, Matt. You were there in 2002 in Toronto.
Yes. So I was 17 years old. I'm a cradle Catholic. I was not raised with the traditional Latin Mass or anything. My parents were always very morally conservative, but when it came to liturgical matters, they were both formed in rural Nebraska in the 1950s and 60s. And I think the prevailing attitude was, if the local bishop says, if this is coming from Rome, if the parish priest approves, then that's right and good. And that's what we need to do. And you don't question it. So, I grew up in an average diocesan Novus Ordo Mass. And my parents were always very musical. They got to playing, guitar masses in the 80s when I was growing up. So I developed a very strong interest in music as a young child, and I wanted to start playing the guitar. I learned how to play the drums. But I started getting into the hard rock kind of heavy metal music, like Led Zeppelin. I know was one of the first bands that I got really into, and Black Sabbath, Metallica, Megadeth, all that kind of stuff, which was, certainly not what my parents were into and was concerning to them, but they wanted to foster my interests. And I formed a band with some classmates at the time, like middle school, junior high. But the older I got, the more serious I got about the music, like practicing 2 or 3 hours a day, practicing it every weekend with my bandmates, Friday, Saturday night. No aspirations for going to college or anything like that. We were going to go to California and make it big, the pipe dream. So my mom in particular was, both parents were concerned, praying for me that I would get out of this. But my mom was very adamant that I attend World Youth Day because she was hopeful that it would bring about some kind of radical change in my life. And by God's grace, she was right. It did do that. Although, looking back on it now from a more traditional Catholic perspective, I don't think it was so much the event itself or anything that the event offered me per se. It was more about how God used it for his purposes, basically letting me live out my dream of being a rock star for a week. So how that happened was, the youth group leader that I went with is very good friends with a man named Tony Melendez, who's a very well-known Catholic musician. He was born without arms as a result of his mother being prescribed a medicine for morning sickness called thalidomide back in I think like the late 50s or early 60s, and they didn't realize that it was causing birth defects until it was too late, basically. So he was a thalidomide baby. But he
Are you
learned,
saying the science isn't always right?
yeah, exactly. So he was born in Nicaragua without arms, but he learned how to play the guitar. He tunes the guitar so that when you just strum all the strings, it's an open chord, and then he can put down his big toe on the frets and basically play bar chords. That's how he does it. Because obviously you can't finger complicated chords with your toes like you can with your fingers. So he kind of he has an adapted form of playing. But anyway, Tony was one of the headline musicians at World Youth Day 2002. What launched his career, he got to play in front of Pope John Paul II. I think it was in like 1987. And that really launched him into the Christian music scene from there. So in 2002, he was playing World Youth Day. And my youth group leader, Pat, was good friends with him, also a very talented musician himself. And yeah, there's some pictures of me there. That's the one on the left is me with Tony Melendez, and the one on the right um, is me backstage with some of the other performers for World Youth Day that year. People probably, if people listen to Christian pop music, they probably recognize Matt Maher is on the left of that photo. He's gotten pretty big in recent years. Then also Steve Angrisano and Tom Booth. So they're like staples in the praise and worship life teen kind of mass, which is what I was attending at the time.
Yeah, for those who are just listening, not watching, we have some great photos. You got to watch it just so you can see Matt with long hair and looking a lot younger. And yeah, and I recognize Matt Maher, of course, immediately. And I guess he was
Yes.
already back then, 2002, already performing.
Yes, and I had forgotten that he is Canadian, so I think that could have been
Okay.
how he got invited. I think Tom Booth may have also been a mentor to him and maybe
Okay.
got him a foot in the door, I'm guessing. Um, so yeah, when we went to World Youth Day, Pat, my youth group director, was playing on stage with Tony, and apparently they were in need of a drummer. And so Pat convinced Tony to let me be their drummer because I had been playing the drums at our Life Teen Mass back home. And so Pat thought it would be a natural transition. And so basically, I got to live out my dream of playing in front of tens of thousands of people on this huge stage. And what I felt like God was communicating to me through that experience, obviously I didn't have an apparition or a locution or any kind of supernatural phenomenon, but God was telling me very clearly, you know, as it says in the book of Psalms, delight yourself in the Lord and he will give you the desires of your heart. That if you live your life for me, if you use your gifts and talents that I've given you for my glory, this is what I can do, you know, this is what can happen. Not that it's always going to happen and that it's always going to be the mountaintop experience, but I think God knows when we're young and immature in the spiritual life and we need that consolation in order to get us on the right path. So I think that's what God gave to me through that experience. I got to be the drummer for Tony Melendez for that week of World Youth Day, which as an aside, it's weird that they call it World Youth Day because like a week long festival. I don't know why they call it World Youth Day, but
Yeah, I
anyway.
never even thought of that. You're right. It never is only a day. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's a whole week long festival. So I think we're going to address some of the concerns we both have with World Youth Day. Concerns that have come up over the years. But in a nutshell, what would you say is good about World Youth Day? Like, would you have anything that you would say, yes, this is something like these things that come out of it or whatever? Would you say anything positive kind of your own experience, but
Mhm.
just from what you've seen of World Youth Day yourself?
Well, I think what you already mentioned is very true. It is a very powerful experience of the Catholicity of the church, the universality of the church, that you have people from all over the world. You know, they speak different. It's kind of like an experience from the Acts of the Apostles that everybody coming together from all different parts of the world, speaking different languages, and yet we're united in the same faith. So I think in and of it, the idea of it, I think, is a good thing, and it can be a very powerful tool for good in the world. I think it's also important for people to see and be in close proximity to the successor of St. Peter, who is supposed to be our spiritual father in the faith. and that he's not just some museum piece over in Rome. Like, he is a real living human being that we are called to pray for and to be close to spiritually. And so I think it does have some positive aspects. Unfortunately, I think it's also, if I would sum up the problems with World Youth Day, I would say it suffers from the same malady in some sense as the Second Vatican Council. Not necessarily that, I'm not saying that everything in the documents is wrong or heretical or anything like that, but it's pervaded by this notion that modern man needs something different than what, and modern mean contemporary man, needs something different than what Catholics of all ages throughout the past have needed. That the past way of practicing the faith is no longer sufficient for modern man, that he needs something new and different.
Yeah, and I think I want to talk about some of the specific issues of this year's World Youth Day in a minute, because it's under Francis, I think it's changing a little bit, even from what it was under JP2. But just in general,
Yeah.
I feel like my issue with World Youth Day, and I'm with you as far as like a lot of the positive aspects of the idea of it, the idea of bringing Catholics together around the world, the idea of being spiritually, like literally physically close to the successor of St. Peter. Those are all very noble ideas and good intentions. I
Right.
think that my biggest criticism is just my general criticism I have of all quote unquote youth ministry in the church, in
Mm-hmm.
that it tends to be very I think it looks down on kids. It looks
Mm-hmm.
down on teenagers, and it expects that, okay, we have to be hip and cool, we have to be emotional, we have to give them lots of excitement in order for them
Mm-hmm.
to be touched and be and have a response, a response of faith. And I feel like, first of all, that literally was never the way it was ever done for over 1900 years. So
Right.
we always brought people in somehow. And
Right.
then and it clearly is modeled, whether consciously or unconsciously, on the Protestant model of youth ministry, the modern Protestant model of youth ministry. Even
Mm-hmm.
Martin Luther wouldn't have done it like this, but the modern Protestant model of youth ministry.
Right.
And I think there's enough evidence in now that we've been doing this long enough that that type of focus, while it does have individual successes, I'm not saying there aren't people who haven't been in their youth group and it's changed their life for the better. And the funny thing is, like, for me personally,
Mm-hmm.
the Protestant youth group I went to when I was a Protestant high schooler had a very positive impact on me, in the sense that I was doing some bad stuff, drinking with friends, partying. I got
Mm-hmm.
involved with my Protestant youth group, and then I changed the direction of my life, and eventually I led to Catholicism. So, like, I get that, but on a whole, this idea that we have to excite the kids, get them emotionally wound up,
Mm-hmm.
that's the only way we really can reach them, I feel is demeaning to them on some level. That,
Right.
these are not. I don't know. I feel like it's almost like they're almost like robots. If we just input emotion into them, they'll respond the
Right.
way we want to. But they're young adults. I mean, they're not kids. First of all, they're young adults, and I think that's probably my biggest general problem, is that just the way
Mm-hmm.
World Youth Day is typically done is to get that emotional response.
I have a quote to share with you on that, in that regard. Another part of my story, which is very providential. So my predecessor, some folks may know, at Catholic Family News, was run for many years by a gentleman named John Venari, who passed away in 2017. So he was actually there in 2002 in Toronto documenting the event for the paper, and he turned it into a book which he co-authored with Cornelia Ferreira, called World Youth Day: From Catholicism to Counterchurch. So they obviously have a very negative assessment
Yeah, thank you.
based on the time. But I think John is spot on when he writes in his section of the book. He says, and he also had a huge musical background. In his teens and early 20s, he was playing in the bar scene in upstate New York. So he says, I neither play nor listen to this music anymore, but I still know a rock concert when I see one. And there are literal rock concerts at these events, that it's not praise and worship. I mean, it's like he documents it. He made a DVD about this. He said, World Youth Day was primarily a rock and roll festival pervaded by the superstition that today's young people are the first generation in church history that are incapable of knowing and practicing the Catholic piety of the centuries. I do not understand why this insult to our young people is broadcast as a love of the youth, quote unquote.
Yeah, and I love that quote. I just, it's so insulting to think that a 15-year-old young lady, 15-year-old man, young man, that somehow if you give them what previous generations were always given growing up, that somehow they just can't accept it. They had, no,
Right,
I need this kind of this, I need this junk food rather than the meat. I mean,
right,
that's what it seems to me that it's
right.
really saying. Um, and like World Youth Day really does, they lean into this idea of the festival atmosphere,
Mhm.
the excitability and
Essentially,
things
that
like
the
that.
faith needs to be adapted to popular culture, or else the kids are going to think it's dumb or boring or irrelevant or whatever, when
Yeah,
that's never been the case.
and I think when World Youth Day was first came about in the 1980s, that idea is still wrong and insulting in a lot of ways, but it's at least a little bit understandable in that you have a situation where a lot of people left the church. People aren't sure why. They're like, okay, what can we do? Youth seem to be like this type of music. We have this new rock and roll music, all that stuff.
Right,
Whereas now, though, we have a like documented history of the past 40, 50 years of trying to
right,
do that. And what are young people more attracted to today? Which parishes have the most young people in them
right.
and have the most young people attracted to them? Spoiler alert for people who don't know, it's the traditional Latin masses,
Yep,
or even, and I'll even say even the, we can have a whole debate on the Reverend Novus Ordo, but even those Novus Ordo parishes that are much more conservative and traditional in how they celebrate the liturgy, they also are
right,
attracting many more young families and young people than your typical diocesan parish, which does none of that.
right. Exactly right. And I think in more recent years, at least under the pontificate of Benedict XVI, if I understand correctly, there have been small number of traditional Latin Mass Catholics represented at World Youth Day. I think there have even been some TLMs offered there. It's certainly not the norm,
Right.
as we'll get into. If anything, it's the exact, it's very stark contrast to what the norm is for those masses. Even the ones with the Pope, there's some terrible liturgical abuses that go on.
Yeah. So let's go into that. So I think one of the major criticisms, and this is from both traditional Catholics and more just conservative kind of Novus Ordo Catholics, is the concern about these mega masses. So you have
Mhm.
these tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people there, and so you want to have a mass with everybody on the last day celebrated by the Pope, but even
Right,
before those. And I think that's a great idea in theory, in the sense of everybody coming together for mass, especially with the Pope celebrating it.
right,
I mean, what a wonderful opportunity it is for so many Catholics to be part of that. So I'm not against the idea. In fact, I'll talk about in a minute. Peter Kwasniewski talked about how you do these,
right.
how they've been done in the past. But what happens is, and let me try to pull this up.
Mhm.
There was a bunch of tweets already that have gone out, but you sent me one from Father James Martin, which he's notorious. So let's see if I can pull this up without messing up the screen completely. Here we go.
There
So
we go.
basically what we see is the
And
picture
if you
there.
click on the photo, it'll get bigger so that people can
Oh
see
yeah,
it
there we
more
go.
easily.
Thank you.
Sure.
So yeah, so there we go. So for those who are listening, basically only and aren't seeing, what we see is communion being distributed at one of these masses. And so you see the young man in his hat and t-shirt and shorts, and a lady in a t-shirt and jeans handing out the Eucharist to him. And there's just a lot of different stations, just kind of randomly.
Right.
It looks like over here on the right, that might be a guy who's just, maybe he's looking at his phone. I
I
think
think
it's
the
right.
irony is that they bother having people hold an umbrella over this woman who's
Yeah,
like like
right.
trying. I don't know if that's for a practical reason, if it might rain, or if it's for reverence or what, but it's just ironic.
Yeah. And so what we see, though, is it's a very casual way of distributing our Lord in Holy Communion at these masses. And in fact, I read where literally I think the first mass, mega mass they had there, literally no priest or bishop distributed communion. It was only lay,
Oh, wow.
extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion, whatever you call them these
It's
days.
unbelievable.
And so, yeah, it really is like this idea that this is this is not uncommon. Like when I went to World Youth Day in 1993, the way they distribute communion in the final day's mass was at this big state park outside of Denver, and basically you were cordoned off into these sections, and then that's how a person would come and distribute communion. I can't remember now to this day if it was a priest or a lay person, but the person who's distributing communion had to basically walk through this entire field, like huge field. I mean, there's 500,000 people there or something like that,
right,
to distribute communion, and just holding it and then handing out. And of course, there's no coordination of like, okay, is everybody there even Catholic? Obviously seeing with the hand. What do they do if you drop the host on the ground and in a field? I mean, all these issues, which for a long time there was criticism. All trads are just very, particular. They're just too hung up about that. But now you see, I think everybody who believes in the Eucharist is at least concerned with this idea. And so, I mean, I feel like this is one of the major problems of World Youth Day is just simply how this is done.
Yeah, the logistics are a nightmare. I mean, as you said, it's a nice idea to have a single mass, but what's more important, having the experience of everybody having a single mass all together, or people actually attending the holy sacrifice as they should and participating reverently, and most importantly, treating our Eucharistic Lord with the greatest respect possible. And I think a great example of how outdoor masses, even for large numbers of people, can still be done reverently would be like the Chartres pilgrimage. I mean, they obviously at an outdoor event like World Youth Day, we don't expect everyone to change into a suit and tie or dress or something like. And they don't do that either at the Chartres pilgrimage, is my understanding. I've never been, but I've seen lots of photos and video footage. A lot of the younger kids are in like scout uniforms and stuff, which is fine. They're for the occasion, that's appropriate. But they still kneel down to receive Holy Communion. That's still only the priest distributing communion, and there's a server with a paten so that in case the host were to slip or fall, that it wouldn't just drop into a grassy knoll or something. Yeah. So there are ways that can be done, as I'm sure Dr. Kwasniewski got into much more detail.
Yeah, what he mentioned was just simply, and he mentioned this a Eucharistic Congress in Chicago in the 1920s that had tens of thousands of people there. And basically what they did was they just simply didn't distribute communion to most people. It was just the people kind of up near the altar. They would distribute communion to them, maybe a few hundred, and that's it. And everybody else made a spiritual communion. And first of all, that's an important thing to note. Receiving communion during Mass is not necessary. It's not something that's like it has to be.
It's not integral to the Mass itself, which has become the prevailing misconception, unfortunately.
Right. And then also you have a situation, and also what he said was low Masses were said throughout the city during this Eucharistic Congress, so people could receive Holy Communion. Because it is a good thing to receive Holy Communion, especially at a Eucharistic Congress. So they could receive communion, but it was done the idea was we're going to keep a reverence for the Eucharist. And of course, with our whole Eucharistic revival happening in this country, I mean, this is an example of where there's no question that the visuals, at the very least, show a disrespect for the Holy Communion, that it's anything other than just a piece of bread. Now, I do want to read a tweet from somebody. I don't have it up on the screen, but I saw earlier before we got on. And somebody was criticizing, how this is going on. I wasn't a trad or anything like that. Just somebody was like, this is not a good idea. And somebody responded, a liberal Catholic said, Holy Communion isn't meant to be shielded under a pretty walled dome when outside hundreds of thousands of young people hunger for the sanctification it provides. And to me, that sounds like a Eucharistic theology that's basically magical in how it's done, in the sense of you somehow, it's like, you have to get this pass, you get your Eucharist, and now all of a sudden you get the sanctification, where being at the Mass offers a ton of graces. Yes, of course, we receive communion in a normal sense, but again, like I said, it's not necessary. But I think it forgets, though, that this is Jesus Christ. And
it's also presuming that how you receive Holy Communion has no bearing on how much sanctification takes place, which is
Right.
also incorrect.
And I think at these mass elements like this, these mega masses, especially with young people, there is the obvious pressure to receive because everybody else is.
Right.
And what if they're in a state of mortal sin? Obviously, I mean, obviously, a teenager can be in a state of mortal sin. They might
Right.
even know that they're in a state of mortal sin and want to get to confession, but they, not able to, whatever. And but everybody's going to Holy Communion, and it's just like, okay, I go up as well. And so there's
Right.
another, the sanctification isn't happening in that case, the exact
No.
opposite, in fact. So I just feel like these mega masses are just, and this has been the case since John Paul II. This isn't a Francis thing.
Right.
I know Benedict talked about the idea, like he wrote before he became Pope, the idea that at these mega masses don't offer Holy Communion to everybody, just for maybe the priests or celebrating or something like that.
Right.
But then in his own mega masses, they offer communion to everybody. So
Right.
it didn't really happen. So now I want to talk to, this is this year's Lisbon conference. So the first thing I want to bring up, I'll read this quote to people, and then you can kind of respond to it, reflect on it. Sure. This is Bishop Americo Aguiar. I think he pronounced his name. I probably butchered it because I butcher most names. He is actually the auxiliary bishop of Lisbon. He is he's the organizer of World Youth Day this year, and he's going to be a cardinal. He's announced that he's going to be created a cardinal
which is really bizarre because his archbishop is already a cardinal. So
yeah, it's clear he's going to be moved to probably a Roman office at some point soon. But and also, this is another little tidbit I just found out today about this guy. Mm-hmm. Before his ordination, he worked in local politics in the Porto region and was a member of the Socialist Party. Did you know that?
I did not.
I didn't know that until about 2 hours ago. It was an article.
Shocking, but not surprising.
Yeah, an article about him. It wasn't stated in a bad way. Just kind of, it was like one of these liberal Catholics writing about it. Yeah, so he was a member of the Socialist Party. Anyway, his quote leading up to World Youth Day was, "We don't want to convert the young people to Christ or to the Catholic Church or anything like that at all." Let me repeat that. We don't want to convert the young people to Christ or to the Catholic Church or to anything like that at all. And then he continues, he says, "We want it to be normal for a young Catholic Christian to say and bear witness to who he is, or for a young Muslim, Jew, or another religion to also have no problem saying who he is and bearing witness to it. And for a young person who has no religion to feel welcome and to perhaps not feel strange for thinking in a different way." So, I mean, for the next 3 hours, please explain what's wrong with that.
Yeah, exactly. It's insane. Does this bishop even have the faith? I mean, I think it's fair to ask that question because the Great Commission of our Lord is to make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that he has commanded them. So what other purpose could a World Youth Day have other than to either bring about someone's initial conversion through evangelization or through their continued conversion if they're already Catholic and making progress in the spiritual life? If it has any other purpose than that, then it's a waste of time. Worse than that, it's damaging souls.
Yeah, even if you want to argue that there's a place for Catholics at certain ecumenical events, certain interreligious events. Let's say we'll even grant that there's a place for Catholics. If people have read my book, Deadly Indifference, no, I don't really think that, but let's just grant that as acceptable. Right. This is a Catholic event. Can't we have our own events that are 100% Catholic and are 100% promoting Catholicism and inviting people to become Catholic? Aren't we allowed to have at least some of our own events like that? Why is it even our own events have to turn to ecumenical events? It's not like the Baptists, everything the Baptists do are ecumenical, or the Muslims, everything they do. Right. I mean, it's like just, we can have our own 100% Catholic events, come and enjoy being Catholic and celebrate it and invite people to become Catholic.
Right. And that doesn't make it unwelcoming. You notice in that quote, in his mind, either you're, what Francis would say, you're a rigid traditionalist or neo-Pelagian. I don't forget all the different insults over the years. In other words, you're either an uncharitable, unwelcoming bigot, or else you have to be ecumenical and interreligious and all of that kind of stuff. It's an either or proposition, which is simply not true.
Yeah, that's a good point, because like I said, even if you want to accept that, ecumenism and interreligious dialogue, we can still have our events, our Catholic events, and it's not like even the most Catholic event you get up there and say, let's go persecute the Protestants or something like that. I mean,
Right.
it's like we're just saying this is what we are, and we believe this is the fullness of the faith. This is the one true church, and we urge you to join it. I mean, that's not
right. And we're not even separating people like in the Old Testament into the courtyard of the Gentiles or
right.
something. They're all intermingled. We're all in the, during the Mass, we're all in the Holy of Holies. So.
Right. Now, also, I think you were the one who first tweeted about this, or at least I heard first heard from you. Is it true that they're also encouraging the youth who go there to like visit mosques and synagogues and things like that?
I mean, that's the only impression that I can gather from this. So this is from here, I'll send you a link in the private chat in case you want to throw it up on the screen for those who are watching. But this is from the official website for World Youth Day 2023, and it's Interfaith Dialogue. It says Lisbon is one of the largest and safest ports on Europe's Atlantic coast. Cultures and religions coexisted there. I mean, that's leaving out a lot of history there with like the Muslim conquest of the Iberian Peninsula and such.
Right.
So it says, take advantage of World Youth Day Lisbon 2023 to visit the places we suggest. And then it has a list of not only Catholic churches, but also a Jewish synagogue. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce the name of it. Inaugurated in 1904, it was the first synagogue built in Portugal after the expulsion of the Jews at the end of the 15th century. It goes on to list 2 different mosques, one of which is belongs to a branch of Shia Muslims. So I'm guessing the other one is probably Sunni Muslims, the 2 main branches of Islam. It even lists a Hindu temple, if you can believe that. It's just unbelievable.
I mean, so this website
is the official website that pilgrims would be consulting for how they should be spending their time.
Yeah, and it literally has links to registration forms saying to better manage the capacity of space, please register using the online form below, assuming that the pilgrims going to World Youth Day, the Catholic pilgrims going to World Youth Day, would go to the mosque, they'd visit the mosque or the synagogue or the Hindu temple.
Right.
And I mean, there's no way. I mean, obviously, my book goes through this pretty detailed, but there's no way that doesn't send a message that Catholicism is just one religion among many.
Right. In that spectrum, I love that image that you have in your book. I forget what you call it in there, but I think at the right side of the spectrum is where it starts going into religious pluralism.
Yes, right.
Like with the Abu Dhabi document and all of that stuff. I mean, that's clearly the message that's being sent, religious indifferentism. There's no other interpretation possible.
And in fact, the interreligious aspect, the interreligious dialogue and ecumenism, it wasn't part of 1993 World Youth Day at all. I mean, I don't know if
this is definitely we're getting into some uncharted territory here.
Yeah, because I mean, this is really pushing now, and it seems like every single public event, every single thing that the Pope goes to has to include all these interreligious dialogue events or some promotion of it. In fact, they're saying that like the fraternity is a big theme of this year's World Youth Day. From his encyclical in Fratelli Tutti, I think it's how I pronounce it.
Right.
And just this idea of human fraternity, which I mean, that then points to the Abu Dhabi Declaration and the Abrahamic House, which we've talked about in this podcast.
I'll just share a quote with you. So this was from yesterday's opening mass with the Cardinal Patriarch of Lisbon. So the primary prelate of the church in Portugal. He said at the beginning of his homily, welcome all, welcome also so this is the very beginning. He's welcoming the pilgrims. He says, dear friends who have come here from around the world for World Youth Day Lisbon 2023, welcome all. Welcome also, the second line, in the ecumenical, interreligious, and goodwill breath that these days have and also bring together. I desire for you all to feel, quote, at home in this common home, obviously a reference to Laudato Si, where we all live World Youth Day. Welcome. So even in the opening mass, it's present.
Yeah, I mean, we want these people to actually come home.
Yeah,
They're
exactly.
not home, and they should feel a little uncomfortable in the sense that, I mean, that's the thing is like if you have a fully Catholic event, non-Catholics can come to it, obviously, but there should be a little bit of discomfort they have in the sense of they feel like they're missing out on something. I know that was my case before I became Catholic. I'd attend some
Right.
Catholic things, and I remember feeling a little left out, and that's a good thing.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah. If
nothing
that's
wrong with
not the
that.
case, then why would you have any desire to convert if you're not missing out on anything?
Right. And I think honestly that answers your own question, because they don't really want people to have a desire to convert, because they're literally saying we're not trying to convert anybody.
Right. Exactly.
Now, I will
Yeah.
say that there was some pushback to that, what the bishop said about the organizer. I know Bishop Barron had said something to the effect of,
Right.
yeah, we are trying to evangelize. Chris Stefanik, who's brought like a huge group of
Yeah.
kids to it, he was saying, yeah, we're there to evangelize. So I just want to make sure it's clear to our listeners that we're not saying every single person who attends World Youth Day is doing something wrong or is like has bad intentions. But I am at least saying, and I think you probably agree, Matt, that the organizers of it this year, particularly, like, I do actually question some of their intentions, because
How can you not when they make
right,
it so blunt? I mean,
right, when they're literally saying we're not trying to convert anybody to Christ, it's like that's not, well, what's
it's
the
not
purpose?
acceptable.
Right, right. I mean, why even have it? So now
Right.
so World Youth Day, we've talked about some general problems with it. We talked about specifics with this year. What would you say, though, Matt, as far as what should the church do for young people to attract them? Should we do anything? Should we just say, they just should come to everything we do? I mean, is there a more traditional equivalent to World Youth Day? And what should be done by the church in this area?
Well, as far as an event is concerned, I mean, as I said earlier, I have never had the opportunity to attend the Chartres pilgrimage. I hope to someday, but I think that would be an excellent alternative because it is definitely a youth movement.
Why don't you explain it a little bit? I know you haven't been, neither have I. Why don't you explain a little bit for people who aren't familiar with what it is?
So, for my understanding, it's a traditionalist pilgrimage. It starts, well, there are two different ones actually that go in opposite directions to each other. One is primarily Priestly Fraternity of St. Peter, I think is like the Ecclesia Dei Institutes is the ones leading it. So they start in Paris and they take a pilgrimage, 2 or 3 day walk. I forget how long. It's a grueling walk. It's like a few hundred miles from Paris to Chartres to the cathedral there. And oftentimes I think the Bishop of Chartres in recent years has been involved and very supportive of it. Michael Matt is one of the experts on that particular branch of the tour, or the pilgrimage rather. And then there's another one, excuse me, that's I think more based in the SSPX, where they start in Chartres and they walk the pilgrimage to Paris. But it's definitely a youth movement. I mean, it's tens of thousands of young people, young families. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the kids are dressed in I think scouting seems to be very popular in France, because a lot of them are dressed like what we would recognize as like Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts, those kinds of uniforms. And I'm guessing it has more of a faith-based theme to it than just the American version of scouting. Right. But it seems to be it's growing exponentially. I think they had over 20 between the two branches. I think they had over 20,000 pilgrims this past. It always takes place around Pentecost Sunday, is my understanding. So I think for something to attend, that would be a good alternative, where you would have the reverence, you'd have the traditional Latin Mass, but you'd also be learning about, like, they have their particular chants that they do. It's a very lively event. It's not like a solemn, people walking around whipping themselves as they walk from one place to another. It's a very joyful event.
I
But as
think
far
one
as
of the things what I feel the key difference between those two type of events, the Chartres pilgrimage and your World Youth Day, is that the purpose of World Youth Day almost seems to be, at least the unspoken purpose, is to have fun.
Oh, absolutely.
And
yeah.
that's not the purpose given for the Chartres pilgrimage. Yet I would be willing to argue that the vast majority of the young people who go, if you ask them later, they might even use the word fun to describe
Right.
what happened. Not, not in an irreverent sense, but just like they enjoyed themselves. They found this, like you said, it's not like they're whipping themselves. They really did enjoy themselves, and they got such spiritual benefit out of it. And they're around other young people, and they're just having a good time. Wow. But that's never the focus of the organizers. It seems like, from the outside looking in. I've gone on a pilgrimage before, not that one or anything like that, a small one, and that's what it seems to be like. Everybody afterwards just feels refreshed. They feel maybe tired too, but refreshed and they energized. But they had a very enjoyable time while getting a lot of spiritual benefits.
And I think another difference is that a World Youth Day, as far as the fun aspect, it's very sedentary. I guess there is some moving around, but basically the difference is that you go to the one place and then you're there for a week and you're milling around to different locations and things. It doesn't really have a particular goal in mind. The goal is to keep everybody entertained for that week, and not so they don't get bored. With an actual pilgrimage, your destination is your purpose, is your goal.
Right.
So you're pilgrimaging, you're walking towards something. You're not just sedentary doing activities.
And it also seems to be, we're, as in almost everything, we're forgetting our past. We're forgetting our own traditions, because pilgrimage has been done by Catholics for 2,000 years. And it's a proven way to energize your faith, I'm using, it's kind of a modern term, I know, but the idea being that you're really, it's almost like a retreat type atmosphere, but you're doing there's a purpose to it, like you said. Now, today though, we're very much, and I've talked about this a few times, but on this podcast, we're very much focused on, we catechize by talking to you. And I know at the World Youth Day I went to, and I think it's still the same, there's a lot of talks given. And there might be some very wonderful talks by some wonderful speakers. And there might be a lot of bad talks. So I know Father James Martin gave one of the talks. So I know at least one this year at the World Youth Day was not a good talk.
Yes.
But the point is like, regardless, it's almost irrelevant in one sense, whether or not the talk is good or not. It's like, this is the only way that we know how to catechize and how to evangelize and energize the youth, is just talk to them a whole bunch. And then the talking becomes, okay, we have to be more and more energetic. We have to include music with it and stuff like that. Whereas in the pilgrimage, there probably are talks at different pilgrimages. There are talks maybe given if it's a multi-day one. I wouldn't be surprised if at times they may give a little talk here and there, but that's not the primary focus. Primary focus is this joined effort to reach your destination, and do it in a prayerful attitude throughout it.
Which typologically is meant to remind us of our journey to heaven. That's the whole point.
Right. Yes, exactly. Yeah. I'm really hoping that heaven is not like a big World Youth Day.
Yeah. Well, it'll certainly be a letdown.
Yeah. Right. That's right.
I think the other element that, especially this year with it being in Portugal, that's being neglected. And I'm happy to say there are some people from the Fatima Center who are there on the ground spreading the message of Our Lady of Fatima, but Fatima should be front and center at this World Youth Day. Not only the event of Fatima, but Our Lady's message to young people. It's amazing that they're not capitalizing on that. But why would they if their goal is not to convert people? Because that's certainly Our Lady of Fatima's goal, is to convert all sinners, lead all souls to heaven, especially those most in need of mercy.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I mean, millions of pilgrims have gone to Fatima over the decades. And it's, right in your backyard, essentially. I don't know the exact geography, but I know it can't be that far away, because Portugal isn't very, very big. And so, like, exactly, to tap into that, you would think that that's like a gold mine. As a cat, if you're organizing this, you're thinking, okay, what's the most Catholic thing about our area? And that's Our Lady of Fatima. I mean, you got right there. So, but like you said, the message is the problem. I mean, it's an uncomfortable message. Let's be honest. In today's church, that we're all sinners, that we need to do penance. All these things are not something that.
But also something interesting. I heard a talk several years ago at a Fatima Center youth conference in 2018, and one of the priests there, Father Daniel Couture of the Society of St. Pius X, he said something that I've always remembered. The first thing that Our Lady did, she didn't open by showing them the vision of hell. The first thing she told them is, "Fear not, I will not harm you." And then when Lucia asked her, "Where are you from?" I am from heaven. She could have answered differently. She could have said, well, I'm from Nazareth, or I'm from the Holy Land, because those would also be true answers. She said, I am from heaven. And it had the exact, Father Couture points out in his talk, it had the exact effect that she wanted it to have, because immediately it got the kids thinking about the supernatural and thinking, well, am I going to go to heaven? Is Francisco going to go to heaven? Is Jacinta going to go to heaven? So the message of Fatima is ultimately a message of great hope. It does have some very serious realities intertwined with it, such as the vision of hell and the fact that many souls are going there. But it's ultimately a message of God's great love for humanity, and that he's sending his mother as a final refuge for us. Her Immaculate Heart is meant to be our refuge and the way that leads us to God, as Our Lady said.
Yeah, and it actually, that fits perfectly, of course, with the idea of a pilgrimage, because you have this suffering and difficulty along the way, but then when you get to the final destination, that is, you've accomplished the goal that you set out to do.
Right.
And typically at most pilgrimages I've ever heard of, usually have some type of, a mass at the end. And so
Right.
It's like, now
and a
you're
celebration
entering
or
into,
something.
right, a celebration. Yeah. You're now entering into that heavenly foretaste of heaven. And
Yes.
it so really does, everything about it, you don't have to say a word about it. You don't have to explicitly tell the kids, oh, by the way, this is going to foreshadow, pilgrimage, or,
Right.
You don't have to say any of that. It just puts it in their minds.
They experience it.
Right.
Yeah.
They experience it. That in order to get to the celebration, to the party, so to speak, to the feast, you first go through the fasting, the penance, and things like that. And I think that's,
yes.
And I personally, I truly believe that's something young people respond to. They don't, and I will say this, John Paul II, who did, of course, found the World Youth Days, and we've talked about some of the issues. He did understand, at least on some level, that you do want to call young people to something greater. And I think that is something that we need to do with the young people, is stop this dumbing down, treat them like the young adults they are, and call them to something beyond this world. Because I think they recognize better than most how broken our world is, because they're still idealistic. They still have in their mind that they have this view of like a perfect world kind of has in their head. And then they're starting to see, oh shoot, this world is nothing like that. And so then when the church comes and says, oh, we'll just be like the world in order to attract you, they're like, that's exactly what I'm not attracted to.
And speaking of that, I'll read another quote from this official World Youth Day website. It says this is under the program section. Here, I'll send you the link real quick in case you want to throw it up on the screen. But it says, under the welcome ceremony, so this is going to be happening tomorrow. Pope Francis, I think, is traveling to Lisbon today. I think he's already arrived, but tomorrow is the first time he'll get together with the youth there. So it says, as it is the first moment of encounter between the young people and the Pope, this ceremony will be an event with a festive and meeting environment, keeping the dimension of prayer. Well, we'll see how prayerful it actually is. It wants to show the young church that sets out with the successor of Peter towards the construction of a more fraternal society. Wow.
I'm trying not to be triggered right now, Matt. I mean, I'm sorry. Okay. I that just is, that in a nutshell is the problem. Our mission of the church, the young church, the old church, I don't care what you want to call it, everybody in the church, is not the construction of a more fraternal society. That might be a noble task of politicians, of lay people at times. I'm not saying we shouldn't try to have a better society under Christ the King, but we should. But that's not the purpose of the church. It's not the mission. Is not a more fraternal society. It just,
not unless you're talking about Christian fraternity. I mean, we're all meant to be brothers and sisters in Christ, but you can't have a more fraternal society when Christ the King is left out of it.
And that is even, I would even argue that is a more fraternal society in a Christian aspect is not the end goal. It's just a result of everybody striving towards heaven.
A natural consequence.
A natural consequence. It's like, if your goal is just simply to make this world better, you're going to make the world worse, and you're not going to get to heaven. But if your goal is let's get everybody to heaven, then you are going to make this world better, because it's going to help make it so people can
Right.
more easily get to heaven. So,
Right.
yeah,
Because people aren't interested in being converted if you're a curmudgeon or something. Like, you do have to be
right.
charitable in order to convert people.
Right, exactly. And just creating a more Christian fraternal society uh, helps people avoid temptation more, because you have,
Right.
laws and different things in effect that would be more conducive towards the practice of
Right.
Catholicism. So,
And that's something we have for a whole other show, maybe
yeah.
the modesty issue. I mean, I know from my
Oh,
experience
yeah.
that was a major problem.
Yeah. And I get, like, I don't even have a problem myself personally. I know some might, with like what you're saying, people at these mega masses where you're out and about all day. If the people are dressed in more casual fare, I mean,
Right.
that's fine. But you're right. There is modesty issues. And like when literally the person who's distributing communion to you has a short skirt on,
Right.
it's like, I'm sorry, but the 16-year-old boy who's walking up, you
He's
can't
not
tell
going
me
to
he's
be
not going to get
thinking about
distracted.
Jesus.
That's right. He's not. And here's the thing. God didn't make him. I mean, God made him to be attracted to those situations,
Right.
because I mean, that's not unnatural for him. The problem
Right.
is that he's been put in a situation
Right.
where it's very incongruous. So, okay.
Yes.
Well, I think we're going to wrap it up here. Is there anything else though? I mean, I think I like this, that this became somewhat of an ad for the Sharp pilgrimage. I mean, I
Yeah,
kind of
I
like
think that's
that,
good.
because that's a great, I mean, I know there's a pilgrimage in England, Our Lady of Walsingham.
Hmm.
They do a pilgrimage there, I think, once a year. I think that might even be in August, might even be this month. I'm not even sure. But there
Hmm.
are, these are growing. I'd love to see one, a nice one in the United States. Do you know of any in the United States that are pretty prominent, or anything?
No, I haven't heard of anything, and I have pretty low expectations for the Eucharistic revival, Eucharistic Congress. We'll see what happens, but
Yeah,
I'll,
I'm afraid it's going to fall into some of the same problems as the World Youth Day. But
yeah.
I do know this. This is a little hint. I'm not going to say too much, but I do know there is a plan by certain people of the more traditional bent to be present at the Eucharistic revival, and to at least present to the attendees perhaps a more traditional way of looking at the Eucharist, and things of that nature. So that'll be good.
Yes, that's
But
good
yeah,
news.
but I would encourage people then, like parents who are watching this and they want their young people to have an experience. There's nothing wrong with having a spiritual experience, that you want your kids to have, that, and teenagers. Maybe look into pilgrimages, something
Hmm.
like the Sharp pilgrimage. Maybe it's too expensive, or just, I feel like there was one in Pennsylvania. There used to be one, but I don't remember. So
That
maybe
could be the
somebody
case.
will mention that in the comments once we put this out there. So,
Yep.
okay, well, thank you, Matt. I really appreciate it. I'm going to put a link in the show notes to, I'll put it to the World Youth Day website so people can see what we were talking about, but also particularly to Matt's article about going from being a rock star at World Youth Day to now attending the traditional Latin Mass. I think it's a good story. You're going to want to read the whole thing. Matt just gave a quick overview of it here, but you're going to want to read that. So.
Thank you so much, Eric. Yeah, that'll be available at CatholicFamilyNews.com. I encourage folks to check it out, and also join us. We do a weekly news roundup, typically on Thursday afternoons, early evening. So you can find us on YouTube and Rumble for that show, weekly news roundup.
Yes, I thank you. I wanted you to promote that. So yeah, Catholic Family News. They have a great website. They do their news, the roundup and everything. So I'll put links to that as well in the show notes, and I encourage people to check that out too. So.
All right.
Okay, great. Thanks, Matt. Until next time, everybody. God love you.